Good morning, everyone. I'm Brian Arcese, Portfolio Manager on the Foord International Fund and the Foord Global Equity Fund in Singapore. And I'm joined this morning by Nancy Hossack, an analyst on the South African team. Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Brian.
Today, we wanted to discuss briefly scenarios and potential outcomes of the US elections taking place incredibly soon. And after I do that, Nancy will highlight some of the resultant impacts, both broadly as well as in particular as they relate to South Africa. So just to begin, the three most likely scenarios from top to bottom. Number one, our base case is that Joe Biden does win the US presidency. In a number of polls that have been amalgamated and combined and then run through Monte Carlo simulations by The Economist, we see that Joe Biden is expected to win 54 to 55% of the popular vote. And more importantly, in the US is the Electoral College. And there, he's expected or has a 95% chance of winning the 270 required Electoral College votes he needs to claim the presidency. As importantly are the US House and Senate races. So in the US, the House is currently controlled by the Democrats. In all likelihood, they will maintain that control with 99% likelihood according to polling. The Senate, which is currently controlled by Republicans, there is a 3/4 chance that does switch to Democrats. And so when we combine all of this in our base case, we sort of have a 75% chance that Joe Biden not only wins the presidency, but that Democrats end up controlling both the House and the Senate. Controlling both the legislative and executive branches would allow the Democrats and Joe Biden to put forward relatively sweeping changes to regulation, including changes in tax infrastructure spending, for example. And Nancy will go into some detail on a few of those. The second scenario is that President Trump maintains the presidency. Polling is now suggesting that he has a less than 5% chance of doing that. We would probably put it somewhere between 5 and 10%, but still it's a far number two, even in our potential outcomes. In this event, it's likely that the Democrats would not only continue to control the House, but it's also possible that they would gain control of the Senate. So you would have a divided government where a Republican and President Trump controlled the executive branch and the Democrats controlled at least part of the legislative branch. That, in effect, would tie President Trump's hands as well as the Democrats' hands. We wouldn't expect any earth-shattering legislation to pass in that type of environment. And then number three, our third scenario, this is the least likely, though certainly not impossible, is that we end up with a contested election. Now, on election night, there may be a handful of states that are too close to call, and that those states may be enough that neither candidate is able to clearly claim victory in the 270 electoral votes that they need. But we do think that there's a less than 1% chance that we wouldn't be able to know who the president is over just a handful of days. But if that outcome were to take place, this would certainly be the most uncertain for the market and investors and result in the most volatility. With that, I'll hand it over to Nancy to discuss the implications broadly and more importantly as it relates to South Africa.
Thank you, Brian, for those well-articulated scenarios. So from the outset, I think it's worth stating that we don't think that any of these outcomes have an outsized effect on the South African portfolios. South Africa is not a foreign policy focus for either of these two candidates, so it is more the indirect policy ramifications that we think will play a part. We are also cautious to draw too many firm conclusions in the short run, no matter what the elective outcome. Listeners will remember the volatility that ensued in markets post-Trump's 2016 election. Typically, the picture becomes clearer as time passes and we see how the Senate and House respond to White House policy. I'll remind you that Trump promised almost $1 trillion in infrastructure spend in his 2016 campaign, but has been unable to effect that level of spending. So we take all of these campaign promises with a pinch of salt. For South Africa, one of the most important aspects will be whether Biden can pass his infrastructure plan. As we have seen private fixed capital investment curtailed post-COVID, public infrastructure investment would boost prospects for iron ore producers like ourselves. And then it's likely that a Democratic administration is associated with a bigger budget deficit and higher inflation, so we think that's positive for gold at the margin. Extrapolating that further, I think that would logically mean that we see a stronger rand relative to the dollar, It seems as if some of this has already been priced in prior to the election with the recent rand strength we have seen. And that obviously puts pressure on rand hedge stocks in general relative to our inward focused SA Inc. shares. However, the one big exception to that in our market would be Naspers. Tencent has certainly been directly impacted by the anti-China rhetoric of the Trump administration. And while we don't believe a Democratic administration will be strongly pro-China, we do think it would be a milder environment for Chinese multinationals. You can already see that type of optimism has filtered into the Tencent share price prior to the election. So overall, we think a Biden presidency and a blue sweep could be a small net positive for SA, but again, we would be careful to draw firm conclusions. As we all know, what politicians say and do seldom bear very much resemblance. So I guess with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brian and just see what your concluding thoughts are, Brian, from here.
Sure. Thank you, Nancy. That was very helpful. I think given the uncertainty, it's just certainly helpful to reiterate and conclude and remind our investors that both in South Africa and in Singapore and the global portfolios, we aren't making 0-1 bets on the outcome of the election, that we are positioning the portfolios for the long term to benefit from either candidate, ultimately winning and being able to weather and or benefit from the policies that they put in place. The positive is that the election is incredibly close, and so we will in all likelihood know the results soon, and we look forward to following up after the election in the coming days. Thank you very much for listening.